Hello, everyone. This is another Games and Warfare podcast. And this time we have a guest, Justin, who has a master in military history and is a long-time supporter and guest of the channel. Hello, Justin.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
And today we will talk about Total War Empire. So, one specific game out of the Total War series, which I classify basically as arcade strategy combined with arcade tactics. So this is, I think, the strong point of the Total War series, that you have both the strategy and tactics within the game. And oversimplified, it plays out. You have a strategic map on the region. This is the main game mode, or one of the main game modes, and the second game mode is basically the real-time strategy battlefield where you play out the tactics. So the strategy game is turn-based, and the battle is basically real-time strategy. And as previously in this series, we discuss core concept which we think this game brings along very well, that makes sense in a military history or military context. So the first one, I think it does very well, is grand strategy simplified. So you have economy, infrastructure, military, research, and diplomacy in there, and they all interact to a certain degree. So, Justin, what is your take on this?
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of the Total War series. I've been playing it a long time. I would say my first brand new Total War game was actually Empire. It's not the point of the video, but of course, Empire has a reputation. It's very buggy, etc. It's fixed mostly with some mods, but anyway, it's my favorite. And the reason why it's my favorite is I think it has, honestly, for me personally, the best strategic overmap of the Total War series. Because you've got three different theaters: the Americas, Europe, and India, and then you've got some trade theaters on top of that. So it's a huge, expansive map, and it models things like the that economics and the balancing between different theaters and all that in a way that is extremely compelling. It's simple. This is Total War is not a simulator, but it evokes some of the strategic decision making really well. Like for example, in my Darth mod campaign right now, I'm playing as France, and I'm finding myself as France, even though it is very simplified, making similar or having similar problems to actual historical France. Like for example, do I invest super heavily in my navy to fight the Royal Navy, but then I've got all these continental commitments because unlike the UK, I'm on the European continent, which means if I spend all this money on my navy, for example, that means my land forces are weaker, which exposes me to attacks from, say, the Prussians, the Austrians, etc., etc. Um, and that is something that Total War, I think, does really well, even if it is simplified.
Excellent. And this is all the interaction you go on. So you need to decide, what do I research next? Do I go for, I think there are basically three research: military, I think social,
Yeah, yeah,
or
socially. Yeah,
and then land reform stuff along those lines. Or I just looked yesterday, and I know there are three categories.
yeah.
So
It's like
like,
economic, I guess, is the middle one.
yeah, economic is one. So for instance, you research land reform, and then like 4 year or four change of crops and everything, and the other is like, okay, you get improved research, or you get a new formation, and you can now build drill school or other stuff, and get improved units. And that aspect, I mean, of course, we must add here that probably most limiting factor of the game is the artificial intelligence,
Hmm.
although intelligence might be a bit of an overstatement here. And yeah, so, and the next core concept we want to take a look on, which you already touched to a certain degree, is the interaction of strategy and tactics in this game.
Yeah, this is one of the most interesting aspects. It's almost unique to the Total War series. Is that you have these basically two different games, and I actually know of people that will only play, like they only like the turn-based stuff, so they just auto-resolve everything. Um, but for most people, you're going to be playing a mix of the two, and decisions you make tactically in real time on the battlefield can have impact strategically, and then decisions you make strategically can have tactical impact. So, for example, in my France campaign, which is what I've been playing most recently in Darth Mod, um, I had an absolute knockdown, drag 'em out, massive war with the Prussians, and I was often fighting really up against the wall. The Prussians usually they were outnumbered me, and they also qualitatively outmatched me, which means I was able to barely win a lot of these engagements. But only win in a very shallow tactical sense, as in I would push the enemy army off the field. I mean, for those that maybe aren't familiar with Total War, is units don't just fight to like they're gone like StarCraft. They can actually route. You can break their morale and they'll flee off the battlefield. And I would often in these engagements lack the cavalry to actually chase down these routing units and actually destroy the army meaningfully. So I could push them off the field, but not conclusively actually eliminate them as a threat. So what would happen is I'd go back to the strategic map and I would push these armies back into Prussian territory, and then within a turn or two, they'd come right back, and I'd have massive problems yet again. And then the inverse of that is, of course, when I did have the cavalry available, for example, to wipe out fleeing units, I could actually meaningfully destroy the army and turn a tactical victory into a strategic victory, because then I'd be able to advance or take a city or whatever.
And I should add here, military historically, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this word even exists. In my Napoleonic cavalry tactics video, I talk about this. There are some historians that argue that since Napoleon lost so many horses and cavalry in the campaign in Russia in 1812, that afterwards, even if he achieved an success, he had the problem he couldn't destroy the enemy's armies as he did before because he was lacking the cavalry to hunt them down.
In the opening battles of the 1813 campaign in particular, Napoleon's lack of numbers and the mediocre quality of the cavalry severely limited his operations, and preventing him from turning his victories at Lützen and later at Bautzen into the decisive triumphs that in previous campaigns they most assuredly would have been.
Yeah, exactly. Like even again, it's very simple, but it actually does a reasonable job of reflecting the reality at the time. And this works in the inverse. So decisions I've been making at the strategic level can have tactical impact. For example, when this war with Prussia started, which was not a war of my picking, the Prussians came fighting. Those goddamn warlike Germans, but but so I had to like dump ridiculous sums of money that I didn't necessarily want to do into just defending my borders in Europe. I actually lost Alsace-Lorraine for a while and had to take peace.
Typically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I dumped all this money into Europe, and I finally stabilized the front and started actually counterattacking against the Prussians. But then later on, what happened is my relations with the Mughal Empire, a very powerful empire in India in my campaign, broke down. And I had a tiny toehold in India that I'd been holding. I made the deliberate strategic choice to basically sell short my military forces in the region. I was basically relying on peace holding with the Mughal Empire. And they eventually attacked me. And then I had to fight a series of very quick and very difficult tactical engagements on a shoestring, basically, because I'd been selling that theater short strategically, and then tactically I was having to fight very strong enemy armies with very weak armies of my own. Now, thankfully, I had the forethought, and again, this was strategic forethought, to build a handful of fortifications that at least I had something to cower inside with my crappy army. And I just barely held. On top of standing on top of a pile of bodies, there are about 5 people left, but I held. And now I've had to dump a whole bunch of money strategically into India, which I'd rather not be doing, but now I'm forced to hold on to what I have.
Yeah, it sounds very. I play as a Prussian, so I don't have any problems with India so far.
Well, that's the other interesting aspect of Empire is depending on who you play as, it completely changes your game. Like, for example, the Prussians very Europe minded. They're continental European power. You're most generally speaking, your game is going to be mostly focused on Europe. Whereas if you pick, say, the United Netherlands, usually the standard Netherlands play style is you kind of hold your position in Europe. You maybe capture Belgium from the Spanish, but for the most part, you're just kind of holding the fort. And you extend and invest heavily into your trading fleets to go send them around the world, and also expand in the colonies. So the type of game that you play changes depending on who you pick.
I mean, this is also very interesting since you talk Prussia, very continental minded, and you see with the German army or with the German military in general, it's very on the focused on the army. Logistics play less of an importance, as I outlined in my Wehrmacht Logistics basically video, because you have a tradition over not decades but sometimes centuries of this thinking and optimized for short campaigns or for land warfare, whereas others like the United Kingdom or the British Empire has a way different look. It's naval forts, it's thinks way more in strategic terms and everything. And I think it's very well reflected in this game also, and it's mostly due to the geographics.
Yeah, it does it. It does it without any hard coding. When you play as Prussia, even if you want to, and I've done Prussia games way in the past. I have hundreds of hours in Empire Total War where I've decided to be Prussia, the world empire. But that's really quite tricky to do, actually, particularly in Darth mod where the AI is a bit better. But um, because you have these very strong continental commitments, you can't just be like, okay, Austria, okay, Poland, I'm just gonna don't invade me. I'm gonna send my army to India. Like, no,
Not gonna happen.
yeah, exactly. Like you're basically forced through your geostrategic position to really pay attention. Like Europe is always going to be your focus. You might be able to squeeze out maybe a small force to send overseas or something like that, but for the most part, you're going to be focused on Europe. France is in a more interesting position in that you can sometimes you have wars in Europe forced on you, and you can focus on Europe if you want, but then France starts the game very dispersed. You have a lot of enemies and you have a lot of territory all over the place, and you need to basically pick and choose what you're going to try and hold on to. Like I opted to actually heavily invest in the Americas, and I just barely held it. And then it took me a very long time, but I finally cleaned out 13 colonies and all that. I pretty much have North America under control. But it took a very long time, and it was a very heavy investment. And then that left me dangerously exposed in Europe, which is why in the first Franco-Prussian War in my campaign, they basically first it was a unprovoked attack by the dastardly Germans, and they swept over the border into Alsace-Lorraine. Basically, I'd actually set up because there's two German states. I'm trying to remember what they are. Württemberg.
Württemberg?
Yeah, and
Westphalia?
Yes, those two. Yeah.
Westphalia declared war on me yesterday. I don't know why. So that's the only reason why I remember.
But as France, I made the decision. I'm like, well, I don't really want. I want to focus on the colonies, so I made alliances, military alliances, and trade agreements with Westphalia and Württemberg, and I used them as buffer states, basically against the Prussians and the Austrians. That worked for a while.
You built a German cordon sanitaire. That's great.
Yeah, it was great until the Prussians wiped them both out, and then
what could possibly go wrong?
And I wasn't really I didn't pay too much attention to it. Like I saw them being destroyed. I'm like, oh, this is a little bit disconcerting, but I have a few turns yet. It turns that I didn't. The Prussians just stormed over the border into Alsace-Lorraine, and because I focused so much on the Americas, all my best stuff was in North America, and I had basically some militia, a handful of line infantry squatting in a fort in Strasbourg. And
so classical Bewegungskrieg, which people usually call Blitzkrieg, but
yeah, and I legitimately lost Alsace-Lorraine. He started pillaging the French countryside. I managed to defeat a few of the field armies and basically negotiated a peace where I lost territory. And then I literally built a fort on the border looking into Alsace-Lorraine, and I'm like, I shall return. But
so you built the Maginot Line a bit earlier.
But that's the kind of decision making that the game will force on you, and that's I think the strongest point of the Total War series, and particularly Empire, because of the multiple theaters.
You already touched on this. So there's also a third part, because I mean there's a different gameplay aspect for each of these theaters as well, right?
Yes, and that's one of the coolest things about Empire is that the gameplay actually changes again without too much hard coding. It changes between theaters. So Europe, it is like you're talking about the finest armies that Europe could put in the field, and the Austrians, and um, you could, and they're just like these titanic clashes between very first-rate forces. But then you look overseas, and the units that you can recruit in the Americas, for example, are restricted. Line infantry that you raise locally, like in, say, Quebec City, as the French, they're colonial line infantry, and they are inferior to European line infantry. In the base game, their stats are a bit lower. In the Darth mod, which is what I play, the stats are similar, but the units themselves are smaller, so they are weaker by default. Which means, and also the other recruiting is like you can't recruit a lot of your elite guard units or anything like that overseas. So your unit roster is restricted, and it's usually supplemented by things like, for example, in the Americas, you could recruit various Native American auxiliary units, like irregulars and things like that. And that so the armies tend to be smaller, they're weaker, and they usually are supplemented by local forces. Like in India, you recruit basically, again, in effect, colonial line infantry, but they're actually reskinned as East India Company infantry. And then you can supplement those with local sepoys, like locally recruited units, again, of inferior quality to what you would find in Europe, which changes the gameplay. And it also means that if you make the strategic decision to build up a sizable European army and send it to the Americas, that's, what would be a powerful army but comparable to others in Europe is now suddenly this wrecking ball in the Americas, because the units themselves, these are like big first-rate European units.
So is there? I think attrition is not. Is it in the? I think I remember it wasn't in their own Total War, but I might be wrong. I can't remember it in this game.
The first Total War to introduce attrition on the campaign map was Napoleon Total War, I think. So Empire doesn't have it, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, it started with Napoleon.
Anything else to add from your side?
I guess there's like two other points. We won't get too much into naval, but there is actually for those not familiar, there's a naval game, and it plays out quite similar to a lot of the concepts we've been talking about with the land war. Overseas, you tend to have like smaller frigate fleets. In the late game, they could start expanding to some ships of the line, but not even then as much. And in Europe, it's usually the big clashes of giant fleets of ships of the line. So it's kind of cool. Like you can have like frigates and all this stuff running all over the place, big battle fleets floating around in Europe, or sometimes when you send those overseas when stuff gets real. And I guess one thing I want to touch on with the tactical battles is that we've talked a lot about how the strategy is kind of strategy simplified. The tactical battles are like tactics simplified, in a good way, in that, as a general rule, units roughly line up with their historical use. There's outliers, like the ones that stand out are mortars, which you often will see, well, not often, but you'll see them used in open field engagements in Empire Total War, where it's not really a thing. And also at sea, like bomb catches and like rocket ships, same deal. Like those were used to attack fortifications, but in game you use them against ships. But those are exceptions. For the most part, like light infantry covers the flanks, skirmishes, scouts, does pretty much everything you want light infantry to do, just simplified. Line infantry, your main line. Light infantry is not going to stand up to light infantry in a direct fight. Light cavalry, faster, good for chasing routing units, but they aren't really like a hammer to crack a unit, like, for example, heavy cavalry would be. Artillery.
So they're not made for charging.
Exactly.
A unit that is still completely in operation.
Yeah, generally you're going to have issues. Yeah, you're going to want to bring in the big boys for that, ideally, or lancers. So they roughly correspond to real world usage, and it tends to encourage somewhat realistic tactics. Again, simplified. And of course, there's gamey ways of getting around it. Like if you want, particularly in Darth Mod, because they make artillery far stronger. But of course, historically in the 18th century, artillery, I don't have the exact ratio in my head, but there wasn't a lot of artillery per number of infantry in an army. Whereas in Total War, you can really skew that proportion. And then lots and lots of artillery can just wipe out armies. You still need a line in front of it, but you can go really heavy on the arty. But if you keep army compositions to fairly realistic proportions, you get reasonably realistic, again, simplified results.
Yeah, except for the AI sometimes, because I've achieved some great victories which should not have happened.
Oh yeah, that's the, and I guess we mentioned it before, but we should really stress it because there's going to people comment if we don't. But yeah, Empire, Total War, the AI in vanilla, the AI is awful. In Darth Mod, the AI is okay. It's better on the campaign map than it is tactically. Tactically, it's not that good, unfortunately. But honestly,
It's also hard to do, I think, to a certain
yeah,
extent.
they haven't been able to figure out how to get the AI to use gunpowder units in particular properly. Some of the Total War AI for melee units is actually pretty all right, but honestly, it's probably the best in Napoleon Total War and in like Darth Mod Empire and all that. That's about as good as the AI's ever been with gunpowder. Um, it's just, I guess, it's a hard thing to program for, like getting it to form a battle line and just approach, and then attack. Yeah, and even with effort from like Darth Mod, when he made that mod, he practically rebuilt the tactical AI as much as he could, and it is better than vanilla, but it's still like you could see the AI struggling to handle like a battle line. Um, it must be just a difficult thing for the AI to understand. Yeah, I tend to have a very kind of simple because some people just get really angry, like why isn't the AI as good as a human? It's like, well, the AI is never going to be as good as a human, and particularly since once you played a game for 100, like I have 700 hours in Empire Total War, I know how the AI is going to act given
Yeah.
a certain set of situations. Um, so it's about not necessarily always exploiting that. It's like setting a limitation to yourself. You know the AI is going to do X when you do Y. So instead of getting angry at the AI for doing that, then just don't exploit what the AI is doing, and then you'll have a more interesting experience. But people don't often think that way. They want the AI to be like real, they want it to be Skynet, which just is not feasible at this time.
Yeah, I mean, we should expand. Like, there's some games like chess. For instance, if you look at chess, the early times, the supercomputer bet the grandmaster, I think Kasparov, or how it was, I got his name wrong. This was basically back then done brute force, and you can do this in chess because there are only 64 fields. So what the AI in that case does is actually it's not really intelligent. It just calculates every possible move in advance, everything. So this is what it does. And you can do this in a chess field because there's one move from each player at one point in time. And there are only 64 fields and there are well limited numbers of units and they have very restrictive movements. And this was, I think, in around 2000, and they used the supercomputer to process all the stuff. And if you compare this with a game like Total War, we have units which are almost not restricted at all in terms of movement in comparison to chess. Everything can move at the same time. And the units also act very, very differently because in chess it's basically melee. And here you have, as you mentioned, gunpowder units, you have range, you have different ranges, you have different movements and everything. So this is not simple. Far from it. I mean, there are some games that achieved it, but it's hard to do.
Yeah, and certain games that have really good AI that come to mind, they're usually simpler mechanically than Total War, because Total War it's more about maneuvering than it is, particularly the Empire, Napoleon, and Medieval 2 era, where the battle pacing is very slow. It's not about actions per minute and clicking and micro. It's about, like, you can see a battle going bad, and it can still take you 30 minutes to lose, for people that aren't familiar.
Yeah.
Because you can see, like, oh no, my left flank is going to collapse, and it's not like StarCraft where it's like, oh, everything's dead and then you're screwed. It's like, okay, well, those guys are probably going to break and rout in 2 minutes, and oh no, all my reserves are used up. So it's less about I need to APM units over there, and more like, well, I know this is going bad, so what do I do, as you watch the slow motion train wreck unfold?
Oh my God, you're a genius. You're a genius. Now I get it. I think you just found a way with a military model how to determine if you have good AI or not, or if it's just AI that overwhelms you. Can you apply the OODA loop? Yes or no?
Let's look at the OODA loop by John Boyd. It is basically an abstraction of a combat operation process that is followed by actors in combat. First observe, then orient themselves, then decide, and finally act. Now, whoever can perform this process faster might overwhelm the enemy, depending on the discrepancy. I think one of the best examples for this is the Battle of France, where the Wehrmacht repeatedly outplayed the French that were just overwhelmed and paralyzed most of the time due to the operational speed.
And basically, a game like Company of Heroes or StarCraft, the AI beats you because it can do so much stuff at the same time, and it can overwhelm you. Whereas in a game like Total War, everything is so slow, or relatively slow, that the AI can't overwhelm you just by actions. And AI usually will kill you in an OODA loop situation, because it can observe, orient, and decide, act way faster than a human can do. So the actions per minute you have. But in a very slow game, the AI loses these qualities. Because, okay, it can act 5 times faster, but if any move takes like half a minute to complete, like you have in Total War sometimes, because the infantry formation changes and everything else, then you can't do this. Where in Company of Heroes, you have a very small map and a very small amount of units and everything. The AI can overwhelm you. I mean, one typical example why dealing with the AI in Company of Heroes 2, we actually had a game once where we played, I think, against very high AI, and I think we tried with you and Andy, we tried the match 3 or 4 times, and your brother, yeah, and I think we finally won when you set out to lock off a whole part of the map that he can't infiltrate there, so that we could focus on the main battle line.
Yeah.
So this you can actually determine if the AI is good, really good, or if it just appears to be good.
Yeah, that's an extremely important point, because some of the Total Wars, even within that series, that some of them that get the reputation for quote-unquote better AI, like, for example, Shogun 2. AI in that is, I'd say the tactical AI is better than Empire, but I think the huge factor in that is that the battle pacing in Shogun 2 is significantly faster than Empire. So there's less time when something starts going bad in Empire. You have time to be like, okay, this unit is going to break in about a minute. I'm going to send this unit over here to deal with that, and it's going to contain the situation. In Shogun 2, the battles are less than half as long in terms of time. When something starts going bad, it goes bad fast. And then the AI will just be all over you, simultaneously moving. When I play Shogun 2, I have to pause a lot more, simply because it overwhelms my APM, because I'm an old grandpa. I can't do this whole like crazy clicking, and it's not my type of enjoyable gameplay. So Shogun 2, that AI will just overwhelm you with actions, as you describe. Whereas in Empire, it doesn't have that luxury. Everything is the maps are so big, the units move very slowly. It can't do that. You're going to be able to. It can, to a certain extent, when you get into 40 unit battles in mods like Darth Mod, where there are, again, so many units and so much is happening because the scale is so large, that is where the AI can can overwhelm you with actions. But usually in a standard 20 on 20, you've got enough time to actually outthink the AI.
Well, thank you very much, Justin.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being here. I love talking Total War.
I felt the same way. Okay, thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.